Countering a spell feels pretty great. It lets you say no when your opponent casts something and keep it from ever resolving at all. In a world where we see more and more enters triggers on creatures and other permanents, countering spells has become even more appealing. But it often feels even better when you use a creature to counter a spell. This is because a creature with the ability to counter spells is less narrow than a typical counter spell. They can add to the board and do stuff before they ever counter spells, or even do it when they enter the battlefield. This video looks at exactly that kind of creature. To be eligible for this MTG Top 10, a creature had to have the ability to somehow counter a spell. With one exception, I excluded Ward, an evergreen keyword ability that counters spells when a creature is targeted with a spell or ability unless the opponent pays an extra cost. I excluded this type of ability for a few reasons. First, it's super narrow, and I don't think anyone who hears creatures that can counter spells thinks of an effect like Ward. That effect is more about making creatures harder to kill, and they just happen to use the counter mechanic for it. For this reason, I also excluded cards with similar effects, like Reality Smasher. That way, we can stick to creatures who can counter more than just stuff that targets them. Also, by virtue of Ward being its own keyword, it really is its own thing, so it didn't feel right to include it here. I've actually looked at Ward in a past MTG Top 10 too, although it could use an update. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 creatures that counter spells in Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. I use a scoring system to rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Draining Whelk. For 4 generic and 2 blue, it's a 1/1 with flash and flying, and when it enters, you counter target spell and put X +1/+1 counters on the Whelk, where X is that spell's mana value. This creature is a callback to Mana Drain, a similar card that lets you counter a spell and then get mana equal to the spell's value. 6 mana is a lot for a counter spell, but that's not really true when you're also adding a body to the board. A body that might actually be a very real win condition if it countered an expensive enough spell. There's nothing a control player loves more than countering a spell and playing a huge flyer at the same time. In both Block and Standard, the Whelk was regularly featured in control decks, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2007. At number 9, I have 2 cards together, Vodalian Hexcatcher and Cursecatcher. I put them together because they would have been number 9 and 10, they're super similar cards, and their stories are intertwined. Cursecatcher is the much older card. It's 1 blue for a 1/1 that can sacrifice itself to counter an instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 1 generic mana. It was largely played in Merfolk decks, which could get some extra value out of its creature type, like by buffing it with a Lord. One of the great things about Merfolk decks is that they can interact a lot more than most other creature types, and the Catcher is a great example. Having the ability to counter a spell like this helps protect your lords or even make your opponent take a turn longer to play a sweeper, which is all you need to win much of the time. However, Cursecatcher stopped seeing play in 2022 precisely because Vodalian Hexcatcher was printed. It's 1 generic and a blue for a 1/1 with flash that is also a Merfolk Lord, granting +1/+1 to all of your other Merfolk, and it makes it so that all of your Merfolk become better versions of Cursecatcher, because sacrificing one lets you counter a non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1 generic. So yeah, maybe Hexcatcher costs more, but it does so much more than the Cursecatcher does, including buffing your whole board at instant speed, which of course also means you can put this counter spell effect on the board at instant speed when your opponent doesn't expect it. So yeah, Vodalian Hexcatcher has supplanted Cursecatcher in Merfolk decks in a big way, and it's going to continue to put up top 8s in every format where Merfolk are viable, and it's unlikely Cursecatcher will ever see play again. At number 8, it's Glen Elendra Archmage. For 3 generic and a blue, it's a 2/2 flyer, and you can pay 1 blue and sacrifice it to counter target non-creature spell. It also comes with Persist, which means that if it dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters, you return it to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter. In other words, this can counter a spell at least twice, and in the meantime, it's also a flyer with a decently relevant body. It's very good at generating 2-for-1s, and while it's restricted to only countering non-creature spells, most decks run lots of those. In Standard and Extended, it was played in Fairy decks that could get more value out of its type, and in Standard it was also played in Revelark decks, which love to reanimate utility creatures with 2 or less power, and that's definitely what the Archmage is. In Modern, it was often paired with Birthing Pod before it got banned. These decks loved tutoring up useful utility creatures, and they liked sacrificing creatures, so the Archmage was the perfect card for the deck. Even if you never used it to counter a spell, you could sacrifice it twice to your Birthing Pod if you wanted to. After the Birthing Pod ban, it started to see more sporadic play in the format in toolbox decks, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2018. At number 7, it's Judge's Familiar. For a white-blue hybrid mana, it's a 1/1 flyer that can sacrifice itself to counter an instant or sorcery, unless its controller pays 1 generic mana. It's pretty sweet that you can roll this out on turn 1 as an aggressive creature that can attack and get in for some damage, and then later in the game it can be cashed in to counter a spell. And just like Cursecatcher, that means potentially delaying a sweeper for a turn, on top of all of its other utility. The fact it has hybrid cost also means it can be played in a wide variety of decks. Sure, you can play it in Azorius where it'll be easy to cast, but any deck with white or blue can play it without too much trouble. For example, in both Block and Standard, it was played in Selesnya and Boros aggro decks. While it's done the most by far in Standard, where it was most frequently featured in Devotion to blue decks, it's actually put up at least 2 points in every Magic format it's ever been legal in, always appearing in aggro decks. In Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, it's been featured in Hate Bear and Death and Taxes, which are creature decks that run lots of aggressive disruptive creatures, like the Familiar. More recently, it's been played in Pauper White Weenie decks. Pauper is a format where only commons are legal. It only became legal there last year, with a common reprint in Ravnica Remastered. Judge's Familiar is going to continue to put up top 8s in Pauper, and its multi-format success makes it difficult to ever count it out of any format entirely. That said, the cards ahead of it are all active too and have big leads, so it may not be able to ever do better than number 7 on this list. At number 6, it's Mausoleum Wanderer. For 1 blue mana, it's a 1/1 flyer. Whenever another spirit enters under your control, the Wanderer gets +1/+1 until end of turn. You can also sacrifice it to counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays X, where X is Mausoleum Wanderer's power. The Wanderer is a strictly better Cursecatcher, and it's also pretty close to being a strictly better Judge's Familiar. The one thing that prevents that comparison from being accurate is the fact that the Familiar's mana cost is more flexible, but if you're playing a mono blue deck, the Wanderer is strictly better, since it can grow and it can even be better at countering spells when it has higher power. With a card like this, it's no mystery what type of deck it's been played in, since it's particularly potent alongside lots of spirits, which allow it to feel even more efficient than it already is, since it can often attack as a 2/2 or even a 3/3. While it saw a bit of play in standard spirit decks, these decks didn't have access to enough awesome spirits to really have sustained success, but it's been way more successful in both Pioneer and Modern, and is still seeing play in spirit decks in the former. It's pretty much the ideal one-drop for those decks, so it may move higher on the list in the future. It's just so good at being aggressive and disruptive at the very same time. At number 5, it's Ertai Resurrected. It's 2 generic, a blue, and a black for a 3/2 with flash, and when he enters, you get to choose one of 2 options. There's the one that qualified it for this list, which lets you counter a spell activated ability or triggered ability, and then there's the other option, which lets you destroy target creature or planeswalker. In both cases, your opponent gets to draw a card. While that card draw is a downside, the flexibility Ertai offers makes that downside well worth it, since you usually get to add this body to the board while countering or destroying something. It's amazing how much Ertai can deal with, as his counter option can not only deal with spells, but many other things that get put on the stack that you'd prefer not to resolve, and he can even be a really good removal spell. Also, in a pinch, you can counter or destroy your own thing if you really need to draw a card. In Standard, he's seen play regularly ever since being printed, perhaps most notably in Esper Raffine decks. This was a mid-range deck with a heavy legendary creatures theme, so Ertai was not only a really nice interactive creature, but his legendary typing made your Kamigawa Channel lands and Plazas of Heroes even better. Ertai is also currently seeing play in Pioneer Dimir Control and Legacy Vial decks, which like to put creatures into play with Aether Vial and abuse their enter the battlefield abilities with Soul Herder and Yorion. Ertai is going to continue to put up top 8s, and it does have a shot at moving higher on the list in the future. At number 4, it's Chancellor of the Annex. For 4 generic and 3 white, it's a 5/6 flyer that counters every spell your opponent plays, unless they pay 1 generic mana, but its ability to counter spells doesn't end there, because if you reveal it in your opening hand, when each opponent casts their first spell of the game, that spell gets countered unless they pay 1 generic. In other words, this kind of gives you a free counter spell up front, or at the very least makes your opponent pay a tax of 1 generic mana, slowing them down significantly. Almost all of the Chancellor's success has come in the Eternal formats, where it's particularly good because of the ubiquity of Force of Will. Typically a free counterspell, the Chancellor makes it so that your opponent can't disrupt your early game plays by casting the spell unless they actually have mana available. It also happens to be good against other free and cheap disruptive effects that are commonplace in both formats. Typically, it sees play in decks that look to win the game quickly, either by reanimating a huge creature or trying to win with a combo. And sometimes it also sees play in aggressive disruptive decks like Hate Bear. You might think running a card that mostly only does something to the opponent's first spell of the game is a small thing, but it lets those decks really get going in a way that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. Plus, you can always exile the Chancellor to Chrome Mox, Solitude, or March of Otherworldly Light, meaning that it isn't entirely useless even after it does its thing in the early game. The Chancellor is another card that's in a pretty good spot to keep putting up top 8s. At number 3, it's Malevolent Hermit. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 2/1, and you can pay 1 blue and sacrifice it to have it counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 3 generic. Then, if it's in your graveyard, you can pay 2 generic and a blue to return it to the battlefield as Benevolent Geist, a 2/2 flyer that makes your non-creature spells uncounterable, and if it would be put into a graveyard, it gets exiled instead. So, you get a 2-drop that can give itself up to stop a non-creature spell, and then come back as a somewhat threatening flyer that makes your own stuff uncounterable. That's a lot of value from only a single card, plus if you discard it or otherwise get it into your graveyard, you can still get value out of it thanks to Disturb. While in Standard it saw lots of play in Control and mid-range decks, it's also gone on to have success in every other format it's been legal in, including the Eternal formats. There, it's been used in combo decks, where both sides of it are pretty effective at protecting your combo. However, it doesn't have any top 8 so far in 2025, and Chancellor of the Annex and Ertai aren't very far behind it. At number 2, it's Spellstutter Sprite. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 1/1 with flash and flying, and when it enters, it counters target spell with mana value X or less, where X is the number of fairies you control. The Sprite itself is a fairy, so even on its own, it can counter 0 or 1 mana spells, and it gets even better if you have other fairies. Countering a spell and adding an evasive body to the board is a pretty awesome exchange, and Spellstutter Sprite was a big part of what made fairy decks so good in Block, Standard, Extended, Modern, and even Legacy. The biggest strength of those decks is that they could somehow be both aggressive and controlling, because many of the deck's creatures were reactive, like Spellstutter Sprite. It still sees play in Modern and Legacy today, usually in decks that have more of a fairy sub-theme, like Murktide or Ninjas. Modern and Legacy are dominated by cheap spells, so the Sprite has plenty to counter, even if it's alone or only has one friend in play. It's also heavily played in Pauper, where it makes appearances in fairy decks and Dimir Control, but it's the most successful in mono-blue aggro decks, which can find ways to rebuy the Sprite's ability, most notably by ninjutsuing in Ninja of the Deep Hours. The Sprite is still putting up top 8s in Pauper now, and while it's been a year or two for other formats, it's hard to ever count it out entirely. And at number 1, it's Lavinia Azorius Renegade. For a white and a blue, she's a 2/2, and she stops opponents from casting non-creature spells with mana value greater than the number of lands that player controls, and she has another ability that gets her on this list, because she counters any spell that opponents cast that they spent no mana on. Basically, Lavinia is really good at hating on anything your opponent might try to do that involves casting spells ahead of schedule while adding a reasonable body to the board. She's what's often termed a hate bear, in that she comes with a 2-mana 2/2 body and hates on lots of powerful strategies. While her effects didn't do a whole lot in Standard, Lavinia has been a very useful creature in every other format, where people try to do far more powerful things. Among the powerful cards that she can counter are anything that is cascaded or Mind's Desired into, pitch spells like the Evoke Elementals or Force of Will, anything you try to cast with Omniscience, and so on. And that's just focusing on her counter ability. Her other ability stops decks like Tron or Cloudpost from going too crazy, since they usually have a small number of lands in play that can produce lots of mana. This has made her both a popular sideboard card and a popular main deck card in disruptive creature decks that can easily tutor up their singleton copy with Recruiter of the Guard. She's going to continue to rack up top 8s, and it's likely she continues to outpace the cards behind her. Basically, as long as people are trying to do super busted stuff in formats with large card pools, Lavinia is going to be good. And those are the exact things that people are doing in those formats. So those are the best creatures in Magic that can counter spells. If you like having creatures that can counter spells, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more than 860 other MTG Top 10s, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.